Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So it's nice to see everyone awake. Everyone's eaten, or unless you guys slept through breakfast. Then you don't have an excuse to sleep either because you should be rested, okay? So the first topic we're going to be talking about today is Sikh culture. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be comparing Sikh culture to Punjabi culture and to what we could call Western culture or North American culture or, you know, the culture that most of us live in, right? And we're going to look at what makes Sikhi unique, what are some of the negative things about Punjabi and Western culture, and what are maybe some of the positives that we can incorporate into our own culture. And also to maybe think about what it means to have a Sikh culture. So I want to have a little bit of discussion about that as well, so just so you guys start thinking about that. I think for a lot of us today, we automatically think of Punjabi culture and Sikh culture together. The fact is that Punjab is a pretty big region. Half of all Punjabi speakers are Muslims. They live in Pakistan. Between the half that's left over, about half are Sikh and half are Hindu. And there's significant Christian populations as well. So to be Punjabi doesn't mean you're a Sikh. That's the first thing. The second thing is, up until the 1900s or 1800s, to be a Sikh didn't mean you were Punjabi. For example, how many of the Panch Pyare were from Punjab? Someone who hasn't answered before. One. Bhai was from Lahore, right? So only one Panch Pyare was from Punjab. If we look at, for example, the historic Hukamname, which were letters that the Gurus sent to different Sanghas around, we have letters from the Gurus, though many were destroyed in 1984 on the attack on Darbar Sahib, but we have copies of them still. These were hookups to places like Dhaka, which is the capital of Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan. There were Sikh communities all over South Asia, everywhere from Afghanistan to Nepal to Sri Lanka to Burma, to the jungles. And there's still remnants of Sikh populations all over that place. I think in the last couple of years, a lot of us have started to learn about Sikhligars, right? Have you guys all heard of Sikhligar Sikhs? For someone who hasn't heard, can someone volunteer to explain who Sikhligar Sikhs are? I'm just going to call somebody then. Benji, do you know what Sikhligar Sikhs are? No, the one taken off. Yeah, sure, you. Go for it. No, you can.
They're basically the Sikhs who make our weaponry.
So they were a unique group, a unique ethnic group in South Asia that became Sikhs during the time of Guru Hargobind Sahib Ji, and they were the weapon makers of the Khalsa Panth. And after the British took over and Khalsa Raj ended in the 1800s, they were sort of forgotten by the rest of the Panth. And it's sort of a big debate as to how many Sikhligar Sikhs there are, but there may be millions, in fact, of people who consider themselves to be Sikhs but have been totally separated from the Khalsa Panth for generations. So there are other small groups like that all over. So that's one of our biggest issues, is that I think almost all of us, if not all of us, are from Punjabi background. Our parents are from a Punjabi background, or if they're not from Punjab, they might be from other parts of India, but originally, if our parents were from Delhi, let's say, their ancestors would have been from Punjab originally, right? It is a Punjabi culture that they have in their house. But that didn't used to be the case for Sikhs. And one of the really amazing examples of that is Guru Gobind Singh Sahib Ji himself. So Guru Gobind Singh Ji died in Delhi, of course, to have died outside of Punjab. And he lived the majority of his life on the outskirts of Punjab. He never went to central Punjab or to Majha area, where most of the other Gurus lived. In fact, even Guru Gobind Singh Ji's Bani, he only has 2 compositions in Punjabi. So the majority of his Bani is not even in Punjabi. So we have really made Sikhi something very narrow by making it something only associated with Punjabi culture. Now, Sikhi has its roots in Punjab, and Punjab is always going to be really important to us, but we can't limit Sikhi to that. So that's sort of what I want us to think about as we go through this. Can you go to the next slide, Paji? So when we think about Punjabi culture today, and we're going to go through the negative aspects of Punjabi culture, I think two things that we can think about that come to mind for a lot of people when they talk about the negative aspects of Punjabi culture are inequality, so that can be caste or gender inequality, right? And sort of excessive consumption. And I think a really good example of that is Punjabi marriages, right? Where every year I think all of us could tell a story from our own families or relatives or friends where weddings cost an outrageous amount of money. I remember when I got married and I told my white friends how many people were at my nut garage, and they were like, how many people were there? And I was like, oh, there were over 1,000. And they couldn't imagine or fathom the fact that there'd be 1,000 people that you would invite to a wedding, right? For a Christian wedding, like 60 people is a big wedding, right? So, that's a cultural thing too. Like, we invite everybody we know, and there's also beauty in that, and it's nice. But the sort of excessive use of money, especially in Punjabi culture. In fact, if we look at a lot of reform movements in Sikh history, the thing that they started off reforming was marriages. So Namdadis today, who here has heard of Namdadis? They tie those white dastars, they're really good at doing kirtan, and they believe in their own Devatari good, right? Now Namdadis, when they started off, were actually part of the Khalsa Panth. Later on, they became separate and against the Panth. But when they first started off, Baba Singh was a great Sikh, and the first thing that he wanted to reform was weddings. And he came up with a rule that in an Anand garage, you cannot spend more than 100 rupees. Now this was the late 1800s, so that was still a big chunk of money. But the point was, let's put a limit on how much we're spending, because this is always the history of Punjab. Especially as we get separated from our religious roots, people start to just go crazy on spending money as a display of wealth. So what's the number one thing you see in Punjab when you're driving on the highways? Marriage palaces, right? Okay, did someone say cows? Besides cows and dogs, okay, and garbage, there's marriage palaces at work. You guys all know, you've seen all those marriage palaces, right? Who here has been to a wedding in Punjab recently? So the actual Anand cottage at the Gurdwara, who goes to that? Like literally only the mother, parent, and brother, sister. So it's like 5, 6 people. So nobody goes to the Gurdwara. That's not the point. That's like it's like signing it at the court, is essentially what it is. It's purely for show. It has no significance. Everything happens at the marriage palace. And what do you see at the marriage palace? More food than is humanly imaginable for people to consume, right? Like people are eating food and they're just literally dropping plates full of food on the ground, right? Well, there are literally right outside starving people, right? So that's sort of the worst excesses of Punjabi culture when we think about it. Can we go to the next slide, Padre? So this guy's name is Banda Singh. Banda Singh has no arms and he's missing a leg. In the year 2000, Banda Singh had his arms and his legs. His daughter, who was a child at the time, was raped by Jats in their village. He's a Majbi Sikh. He dared to go to the police. And after years, 3 of the men who raped his daughter were sentenced to jail in 2006. Coming home one day to the village, walking, he was attacked by the Panchayat members of his band, who were all just Singhs, who beat him so badly with metal rods and left him to die in the gully. Somebody found his body and took him to a hospital, but when he went to the hospital turned him away because he was low caste. So because it took him so long to get to the hospital, he lost both his arms and his leg to infection. So today, Banda Singh is an activist for Dalit rights. Now, Sharmti Galia, that he is a Monna fighting for activist rights because he saw no place for himself in Sikhi. And no Sikhs stood by him when these crimes committed. In fact, it was people who look like us who committed these crimes against his family, right? The next slide. So, Dalits or low caste people in Punjab are 30% of the population. They own less than 3% of Punjab's land. So when Baba Banda Singh Bahadur, we'll be talking about this on Sunday, so I don't want to get into it too much, but Baba Banda Singh Bahadur freed Punjab in 5 months from Mughal rule. And he did it by giving land to the poorest people and taking it away from the rich. So we think of ourselves as, you know, the regular Sikhs who are like the working man, but in reality, most of our families are the man, like the people who are oppressing other people in Punjab today. Let's go on to the next slide. Historically, what we would call low caste or Majbi Sikhs played a very prominent role in the Khalsa Panth. By Jetha, who carried Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji's cease to Anandpur Sahib, Akali Fulla Singh, one of the early Nihangs and one of the greatest warriors of Sikh history, was low caste. And 2 of the greatest scholars of the Sikh Sabha lived, Professor Gurmukh Singh and Gyani Dit Singh. Gyani Dit Singh was a low caste Sikh who educated himself and became one of the main writers of Sikh history. In all of Sikh history, he became one of the main people who wrote books. He wrote over 100 books on Sikh history. Gyani Dit Singh used to go to gurdwaras in the early 1900s to give katha. They would let him on stage to do katha, but after he did his katha, they would make him go sit in the shoes because he wasn't allowed into the divan. Because in the early 1900s, the gurdwaras were controlled by masands that wouldn't allow women and low caste people into gurdwaras. And they wouldn't serve him prashad. Professor Gurmukh Singh was kicked out of the Khalsa Panth by the Jathedar Vakal Thakur for fighting against the caste system. So the problem of caste system comes up again and again in Punjabi culture. I want to just take a moment to think about what the caste system is. The caste system, in a very simple way, is the world's oldest and strongest and best organized slave system in human history. Does anyone know how long the caste system has lasted in India? That's kind of I didn't need it. Anybody?
5,000 years.
Yeah, about 5,000 years. So since the Aryans, or people with light skin, invaded India and pushed dark-skinned people down south, there has been a caste system in India. What is a caste system? It means that people at the bottom are not allowed to read, write, or defend themselves. So if a low-caste person listened to the Vedas, for example, what was the punishment according to Manusamriti, the main Hindu rule book? What's the punishment if a low-caste person hears religious words? Anybody know? What? Molten lead into their ears. And if they dared to speak Sanskrit, what was their punishment? They'd cut their tongue out. If a Brahmin killed a low-caste person, what's the punishment? Anyone know?
Nothing.
Well, they had to pay money to the family. Okay? If a low-caste person shadow fell on a Brahmin, what's the punishment? They can be hung upside down and beaten. Okay? So this is a caste system. Now the greatest thing about the caste system is this. In North America we can say, and it's not really the case, and we know that looking around, that people who have historically been oppressed, it's hard for them to make it out. But the ideal in America and Canada is that if you work hard, you can make it, right? If you're a low-caste person in India, and you work hard your whole life, do you have any chance of moving up? What is your only chance of moving up the caste system in India? No.
Rebirth.
Women are allowed to marry up the caste system because upper caste men want to choose who their wives are. So if they see a woman they like, they can take her and make her their wife even if she's low caste. But if a low caste man marries a high caste woman, he will be killed. And that still happens in a lot of places in India today. So marriage is not the way out. What's the only way out of the caste system?
Rebirth.
Anji? Rebirth. So, if you are very, 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 very good at your job in the low caste, and you never speak against Brahmins, you never cause problems, you do your job, then maybe in your next life you will be born in a higher caste. And finally you'll work your way up to be a Brahmin. So why has it lasted so many years? Because any time you act up, then the punishment is that you will be born lower next time. Who's on the lowest end of the caste system? Lower than even low caste people. I do. Lower than untouchables. Women. So even a high caste Brahmin woman, only if she serves her husband faithfully her whole life, and when he dies, kills herself because her life is worthless without her husband, can be reborn as a low caste man in her next life, and then work her way up. So according to Hindu belief, the lowest man is still higher than a woman. So this is the caste system. So that's what the gurus are working in. So we talk about, some of us talk about caste, make caste jokes and stuff. What we're really taking part in is essentially making jokes about a slave system that has oppressed people for thousands of years and has lasted through Mughal invasion, British invasion, everything. It just keeps on going. Let's go to the next slide. So we then get to the other big inequality in Punjab that I think all of us know about, which is gender inequality, right? So this number is for all of India. It's estimated that 10 million girls have been killed by not being allowed to be born in the last decade. And you can see that over the last 50 years as technology has increased, so access to ultrasounds, for example, the number of girls being aborted has gone up, meaning the proportion of girls is lower and lower, right? So in a healthy population, like let's say North America, for every 1,000 boys, there's 1,005 girls born. In Punjab, it's 830. Can we go to the next slide? So we like to talk about how Sikhs believe in equality, right? It's the first thing we talk about when we tell people who aren't Sikhs about Sikhi. So white on the map is where there's no gender imbalance. Light red is where it's not too bad. And dark red, almost black, is where it's worst. Where's worst on this map? Punjab. So the land of the Gurus is the worst place when it comes to gender equality. And all those places in South India that we criticize for being Hindu and believing in the caste system, all this other stuff, they're way better than us when it comes to this. So we've done a really good job of talking about it, but we are horrible at implementing it. I remember talking to a nurse in a hospital in Surrey, and she was a white woman, and she said, I can tell right away if a girl's been born or a boy's been born to a Punjabi family. Do you know how she could tell? If they were crying, yeah. If they were crying. So we think about it as almost normal, but to someone who doesn't know about this, the fact that you would mourn a child right from their birth for being the wrong gender, then it creates a culture where that person is devalued at every stage. Should we go to the next slide? And so that's why, for example, over the last year, we really heard a lot of information come out about rapes in India, for example. And the more disturbing part was the response of people in power. So what was the response of the Catholic Jatsuda, for example, to the rape of the woman in Delhi? Does anyone know?
That she shouldn't have been wearing a skirt.
Yeah, she shouldn't have been wearing a skirt, okay? Now, do rapes happen more in countries where women are free to dress how they want, or in countries where women are restricted in their dress?
Restricted.
The most rapes happen in Islamic countries where women are covered up. And most rapes happen not by strangers, but by family members. So this type of big idea, like, it depends on what the woman's wearing and how she's acting, this is just a male way of getting out of responsibility. So the truth is that it happens in the house, and it happens not because of what someone's wearing, it happens because of power relations, right? And abuse of power. So the numbers are really horrible, and the 53% of Indian children having suffered sexual abuse, that's actually male and female. That's according to the UN. And 69% of Indian women have been assaulted by their partners, and every hour, 18 Indian women are raped. So if and we don't need to go back, but if we look at this, these are numbers for all of India. All of these numbers are worse for Punjab, just so that we know. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So, the place where alcohol is against Sikhi, right? We have one of the highest alcohol consumption rates in the world. Okay? And this has actually been government policy as well. You'll see all over Punjab that there are distilleries set up by the state government. And Punjab is one of the only places in the world where you can go to where they make alcohol and buy it by the glass. So if you were to go to a Molson, or I don't know what a beer company is in Canada, in America, Coors, I guess. If you go to a Coors factory, right? You couldn't go there and get a glass of beer, right? They would turn you away. It's ridiculous. But in India, you can go to where sharab is made and you can buy it by the glass, which is what people do. So this is also state, a way of keeping people down. It's the same thing they did to native people, right? You keep them drunk so that they don't know what's going on with them. Let's go on to the next one. Those guys are so fat and gross. I can't Do you think they notice that their bellies are touching? So this is where my hypocrisy comes out because I'm not in the best shape. Jolas can only slim you down so much. But the fact is that Punjabis who had a history of being considered the healthiest people, the strongest, are now at the highest risk of heart disease in all of India. And India is one of the highest countries of heart disease risk in the whole world. So while there's people starving, the middle and upper class in India is literally dying from eating too much. And we all know that diabetes is a huge problem in our community. Just gigantic. Sugar. So you can go to Punjab and you can go to a farm, one of our relatives, for example, and that person will have debts, unbelievable debts. They will not be able to afford the payments on their equipment, but they will dare not work in their own fields because none of their other neighbors are working in their own fields, and it's a matter of honor that they don't want to lower themselves. So instead of exercising and doing something and not putting yourself in debt, you've created a culture where to show off, and what do the boys do in Punjab? Like 40 years ago, our fathers would have been working in the fields with our grandfathers, right? But what are our cousins and brothers doing in Punjab today instead of working in the fields? They're doing drugs, right? So when they talk about drug consumption rates in India, in Punjab, for example, they don't even count heroin because it's impossible to track. The level of heroin consumption in Punjab is huge. And part of the problem is that most of the world's heroin comes through Punjab, right? Because it comes out of Afghanistan and through India to the rest of the world. But the fact is that the heroin consumption, even among women, so it's not just men anymore, it happens in colleges, in schools, everywhere in Punjab, drug use is just through the roof. Let's keep going. So here we have, Babaji being given a sropa from Akaltakat. Does anybody know who else got a sropa from Akaltakat in the last 100 years?
Dyer,
100?
General Dyer.
Besides bad guys, who were the good guys that got sropas? Anybody know? Paisa Paida Singh? Did he really? Yeah. Okay, before this. We're talking about historical. 1900s. Paida Singh, Bhagat Pooran Singh. Okay? And Baba Kark Singh were the three people who got sropas from Akaltakat. Baba Janel Singh was given one after he was shaheed. So we are now giving the highest honor that Sikhi gives to this guy, who started off in the 1960s owning 80 acres of land, which is a lot, but not huge. Baba now owns parking lots in Manhattan and clubs in London. So the question is, where did that money come from? right? And I'm sure you guys don't need to be told how expensive land is in Manhattan, right? Punjab's debt. So Punjab, which used to be the richest state of Punjab, the corruption level is so high. Literally, how do they run elections in India? How do they get votes in Punjab?
Whoever's more.
You literally Baba sits there in a red chair, and people come up and he gives money out. And from the latest SGPC election, an official from the Indian government himself wrote a report saying the use of alcohol and drugs to buy votes is so high that it's troubling. So the Indian government is itself worried about how much Punjabi and Sikh politicians are using alcohol and drugs to buy votes. And that's not for Punjab election, that's for Gurdwara elections, okay? For the Gurdwara, for the committee that runs our historical Gurdwaras. Punjab's debt right now is $30 billion US. Okay? Let's go to the next slide. So I think we spent enough time going on about Punjab. And we can go on to... Yes, those kids are very bad, okay? So we're going to go on to a sort of critique from a Sikh perspective of Western culture. So could you go to the next slide, Bhai? So the main driving force of Western culture is consumerism. Now we have to be careful when we criticize consumerism because we're not communists. The Gurus believed in capitalism. They believed in people having the opportunity to make their own life, to choose the jobs they wanted to do, to work for themselves and make themselves, their lives and their families' lives better. In fact, Guru Ram Das Ji created a system where he would give out microloans, interest-free loans, to low-caste people to set up businesses in Amritsar. So that people who were trapped in caste professions could come to Amritsar and start a new life and be given, and Guruji in fact gave the best areas of the town to the poorest people and gave them the best markets so that they would have a chance to succeed. But at the same time, the sort of rapid consumerism that we have today in North America, that is definitely not in keeping with Sikhi values. Because what it does is, and remember one of the main goals of Sikhi is to be, or the main goal is to be Vaiguru-like. And Vaiguru's essential quality is of being sovereign. And consumerism makes us a slave. Either, like this quote here, we are slaves to addiction, and I think we all know that, right? Because as soon as a new iPhone comes out, the old one looks really terrible, right? Or we are slaves of being envied, because as soon as a new iPhone comes out, if your buddy has one, that looks even worse, right? And that's the type of culture that we live in. Let's go on to the next slide. Anyway, I remember, and you guys all know this, the TVs that we had growing up, how long did they last us? Forever. We had this weird TV that had the weird dial remotes that I used to play my Super Nintendo on, like, it was like 40 years old. And now, an LCD TV, what's its lifetime? Does anyone know?
5 years.
5 to 7 years, right? Like, it's literally made to last 5 to 7 years. And do you know what cars are made, what a lifetime of an average car is now? Like, it's made by the manufacturer to break apart after how many years? Does anyone know? 10 years. So car is made to last only 10 years now. Because if you make it too well, what will happen?
We'll get more business.
We'll buy new cars, right? So this is a picture of a dead woman from Bangladesh from the factory collapse this last summer. Does anyone know how many people died in the factory collapse?
10.
Sorry? Anyone know?
10?
10? No, it wasn't 10. No, it was hundreds. There was over 600. And what were they making in that factory?
Kapde.
It's not that funny, guys, to be honest. They were making the clothes that we're wearing right now. They were making Gap clothes, they were making Banana Republic clothes, they were making Nike clothes. They were locked in there. They were forced to work there. Women who got pregnant, if they told them that they were pregnant, they wanted to work less hours, they would be fired, so they had to hide. And at this one factory where the collapse happened, in the year before the collapse happened, 6 women miscarried because they were forced to work so hard. Okay? So everything that we use, the electronics, our computers, our phones, are literally made off of other people's blood, sweat, and tears. A chocolate bar. Does anyone know how chocolate is made? Where chocolate comes from? It comes from slave labor in Africa. Almost all chocolate is made by slave labor in Western Africa. Do you know who it is that grows the chocolate? It's children, young children. So everything that we consume is a part of. Now, I don't know what the solution is. And it's naive to think that we can be totally removed from that. And it's also naive to think that we should totally stop, because in some ways, for example, for many Bangladeshi factory workers, and this is what we need to be clear about not making big black and white statements, right? Is that they would rather have this job than no job, right? But the fact of the matter is that the companies could be paying them even a few cents more and giving them a day off every 2 weeks even, and their life would be so much better. And the companies would still profit, we would still get cheap things. But the fact that we don't care at all means that they can get away with literally murder, right? Let's go on to the next slide. So, I don't think we need to go into this too much. We all know about climate change. We all know about environmental degradation and how much we're destroying the environment. This is a picture from Canada, from the tar sands in Alberta. So that the damage that we're doing to the environment is not damage that can be corrected, right? I don't think we need to go on a bunch of this. It's too depressing. Let's go to the next slide. And this is the problem with consumerist culture, is that, like I said earlier, we are constantly wanting to throw away things, right? So that there are whole societies, economies in Africa and India where people literally make a living off of going through our garbage and pulling out metal and gold and other stuff out of our wiring and stuff. Like that's what they spend their lives doing, is going through the garbage that we make, taking it back into raw materials, making it into new products to sell back to us. So we're essentially buying stuff that becomes garbage that is made back into new stuff that we're going to throw away into Europe. And it's just a very stupid cycle. So that whereas before we would have been happy with a product for years, and I think we all, maybe you guys not so much, but I'm not that much older than most of you, I'm 30, but I remember when I was younger, like, my mother would fix our clothes when they would get a rip in the pants, you know? Whereas for us nowadays, I don't know, even for my own kids, we just buy them a new pair of pants, you know? Like, who's going to bother when a pair of pants costs $10, right? From Walmart. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, it's cheap. So another issue with Western culture, and we touched on this yesterday, is that for most people, religion has no meaning anymore. Quebec's a really interesting example. I lived in Montreal for a little while. The Catholic Church was really powerful, and now there's a situation in Quebec where literally all their churches are turned into condos because no one goes to them anymore. They had this huge building in downtown Montreal, which was like 3 city blocks long, and it used to be a monastery for monks, and there were 3 guys living in this giant building. Because who in today's day and age is going to dedicate themselves to being a monk, right? And not get married and not have possessions their whole life, right? So traditional religions just don't appeal to people anymore. In fact, America is one of the few cases where church attendance is still pretty steady because your country's a little weird, you know? Let's go on to the next. This is Richard Dawkins, who I actually kind of like, and a lot of his criticisms of religion are even, in fact, echoed in Bani. You can see that Guru Nanak Sahib in Bhagat Kabir Ji criticized religion just as strongly as a lot of the atheists do today. But the fact is that in a culture where everything has to be explained and rationalized, you lose out on the beauty of spirituality. And so this culture is really empty in a lot of ways. The next slide, please. So basic questions, like anytime there's a natural disaster, like the earthquake in the Philippines, or the earthquake in Haiti, or the tsunami in Japan, the number one question that people start to ask is, why does God let evil things happen? Because if you believe that God is some guy up in the sky, and if you believe the stories where God used to send punishments to people for being wicked, then when bad things happen like that, then you start to think, is God evil? Is God doing bad stuff? What do we do to deserve this? Where a Sikh response, what was a Sikh response to for example, the Bardaka Luka, where in one day, half of the Khalsa Panth was killed. So I want you guys to imagine that. Half of all Sikhs were killed in one day. What was the Khalsa Panth's response? Anybody know? Did they cry? Did they say, why us? Did they say, why do you hate us? Why do we have to suffer so much? One Sikh's response was, it's good, now we're stronger. The point being, not that it's good that so many Sikhs have died, but what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. That we are going to become a stronger, more powerful Panth. Within 12 years of the Bardaka Lukada, Sikhs had freed all of Punjab and started Khalsa Raj. 12 years. So Sikh response to tragedy is not to cry about it, but it's to be in a state of Chardikala. So when your religion looks at things between good and evil, where everything has to be good and evil like that, then you're going to be disheartened by it. And that's why these religions don't appeal to people anymore. Let's go on to the next slide. But we can see, like Madonna's quite famous for, being into Jewish stuff, and then she's into yoga, and she's into, I don't know what she's into now. And Oprah, of course, has made a whole career. She's one of the richest people in the world, essentially selling pseudo-spiritual advice to people, right? Because even though religion doesn't have a place in people's lives, they still feel empty. So they still want to connect to their spirit, they still want to connect to something bigger, they want to have some meaning in life because everyone realizes, hey, we're going to die one day, and there's got to be more to life than this. And so we see the sort of rise of celebrity spirituality with kind of a fad, right? So for a little while, yoga will be really popular, and then in a while, Buddhism gets popular, and then Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism will get popular, and new things will keep coming up. And after a while, that fad will go away, and people get into something else, right? Because it's just a way for people to fill the emptiness that can't be filled inside. Let's go on. Sorry, next slide. So the problem with this obsession with consumerism is that because we're always looking for perfection, and we're always looking for something to be better, because we live in a culture where everything is sold, we turn that in on ourselves. And so we all know problems of eating disorders, right, and self-harm, and all these other issues that are very prevalent in modern society. And for a long time, these were issues that were considered to be just for women. If you could go to the next slide, Bobby. But we now know that these issues affect men as well. This guy was a male model who became so insecure about how he looked that he literally starved himself to death. He died a few years ago. Tragically. So this is not just an issue that's a female issue, it's also a male issue. And I know it is because for the first time in the last few years, I noticed that when I was hanging out with my wife's cousins, for example, that their legs and arms were really bare all of a sudden. They didn't have any hair on them. So whereas we always used to worry that it's just Punjabi girls who feel pressure to shave and remove body hair, I think we all now know that there's Punjabi boys that do their eyebrows, right? That shave their legs, that wax. So that this is just the culture that we live in where everyone is ashamed of how they are made and how they look and how Vaheguru created them, and is always trying to reach some capitalist-driven model of perfection, which is always going to change. Can we go to the next slide? So we had a hard time finding an image that wouldn't be inappropriate, so here you go, that's Paris Hilton eating a Carl's Jr. burger for some reason. Okay? So, we know that sex is used to sell everything, even burgers, right? Or maybe especially burgers, I don't know. Because when the whole point of everything is to sell and to make money, then you're going to use what works best, which is, in our culture, unfortunately, sex, right? You go to the next slide, please, buddy. And this has led to the fact that even children are now sexualized. And I think we know this where, for example, when I'm getting a bathing suit for my daughter, because she's in swim classes, they have bikinis for like 5 and 6-year-old girls, right? So that even little girls, they have padded bras for girls who are 10, 11 years old now. Or you guys can see Halloween costumes for little kids are just horrible, right? Like, it is unspeakable. So that nothing is sacred in a society where everything is consumed and sold. And these are the values that we are imparting to our children, or that we are growing up in, when we don't create our own unique culture, our own Nyala path. Let's go to the next slide. So, one of the big issues, and I'm not here to give a solution to it, because to be honest, this is not a problem that is easily solvable. Because to be honest, in the Guru time period, you got married when you hit puberty. So that the Gurus were all married, besides Guru Amar Das Ji, by the time they were 14 years old. Guru Gobind Singh Ji had Baba Ajit Singh when he was 17 years old. Guru Nanak Sahib Ji, he was a father when he was 15 to Sri Jung. And Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji was 11 years old when he married Mata Guru. So that in the Guru time period, the issue of having feelings, which are natural and we can't deny, and then not having an outlet for them wasn't an issue, because people just got married as soon as they hit puberty, right? Which is not an option for us here. I'm not saying that we should do that, because we live in a culture where we need to get educated to a certain level. You need to grow up, and being an adult requires attaining a lot more skills that keeps getting pushed further back. And now we can all see that, people are saying being a child or being a teenager is going even longer, whereas people, when we were younger, my parents used to say, you're lucky you're not Gode, they kick you out when you're 18, right? I don't know any Gode who get kicked out when they're 18 anymore. Now they're Gode who live in their parents' homes till they're 30, right? So people live and stay as children or teenagers for a long time now. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is not this sort of idealized romantic love. Because all our culture, all our songs, all our music is about how this is the ideal. But the truth is that being in relationships at a young age, when you're still developing your sense of self, when you're still open to being insecure, when you're still open to peer pressure, when you're still developing your core values, and then being used by somebody or having your heart broken or your infatuation rejected can be very damaging psychologically. And we know that. We see that in our peers, where people will fall into negative patterns in relationships that will impact them their whole lives. So this is a bigger discussion that we need to do. Pretending like it's not a problem and just saying don't go out, don't have dates, don't speak to the other gender, that's not a workable solution either. We know that, right? But the solution is not to mimic what happens in the culture around us, because that's not a healthy alternative either. And we can see that with the level of broken marriages and the impact it has on children. Let's go to the next slide. So here we have a Shabad from Guru Arjan Sahib Ji, Nimik Kaam Swad Karan Kod Dines Dukh Pave. So for one mimic, for one instant, for a moment of swad of kaam, of sexual pleasure, you have cursed yourself to pain for countless days. And you're going to regret what you do for years and years. And this isn't, usually this is directed at girls, but it's true for men as well, because we have a weird culture where it's considered where guys don't have feelings and only girls get impacted by stuff like this, but we know that's not true. Whereas you can be really damaged by purely lust, right? And that's not how you build a stable and healthy relationship. And I'm not saying that having an attraction to someone isn't a normal, healthy part of having a healthy marriage. But it cannot be the basis for a relationship. Because time and time again, Sikhi tells us that good looks don't last, right? Nothing lasts. You're going to die. The person you're married to is going to look very different in 30, 40 years, right? So your relationship needs to be based on core values, on connections that run much deeper, that don't change like that. Let's go on to the next slide. So I spent a lot of time here really breaking down Punjabi and Western culture. But I don't want to be totally negative about it. Let's go on. There's a lot in Western culture, for example, that's great. Now, I'm not saying the government system is perfect. I mean, in America especially, you guys, it's like a gong show with your shutdowns and your Senate and Congress and stuff. But it's still better than most countries in the world, right? We can agree with that. And even though there's corruption, you don't have to pretend there's not corruption. The level of corruption is not like India, where if you get pulled over by a cop, you don't even want to give them your driver's license, right? Because you're not going to get it back in India. So, level of corruption, governments can still be held to account. You can make changes even if they are sometimes superficial. Let's go on to the next slide. Increasingly, we can see over the last 50 years, okay, I know he's a disappointment, but that's not the point, okay? He's a good guy, but he didn't live up to the hype. You can agree with that. I'm not a Republican by any stretch. Unlike Joe Thompson. But the point is that 40 years after the blacks in a huge section of your country couldn't vote, to have an African-American president is just incredible. And the fact that women now increasingly hold positions of power and leadership in all fields, business, education, and government is really impressive. So increasing amounts of equality is a positive. And that's something that can be valued, and that's something that Sikhi can agree with and even take on as Sikh values, right? Because that's something that we agree with. Move on to the next. So, welfare and social assistance, or, I mean, to the rest of the world, the fact that Obamacare is such a controversial thing is really shocking, because every other developed country has socialized medicine. Because why would you want to help people who can't pay for their health care? But the fact is that Western countries take care generally of people who can't take care of themselves, right? Whereas in India, if you're poor, you don't get education, you don't get to go to a hospital, you don't get taken care of. In Canada, even if welfare is horrible and you can't really make too much of a life off of it, at least you're not going to starve to death, right? At least your children will get to go to the same schools as other kids, and at least you're going to get the same level of health care. So these are positives that we can get. And these are values that the Gurus created, because Langar was all about free and equal access to food. The Gurus built hospital, which was free and equal access to health care. Guru Angad Sahib Ji built schools and started educational institutions where everyone was free and open to access literacy. And that was a huge thing, because we talked at the beginning of what the punishments were under the caste system for learning language. Just for learning language. Let's go on to the next slide. So in Punjabi culture, so there's 5 people on that, okay? So I think one aspect of Punjabi culture that we can all value is family support. So I got married when I was 22, and me and my wife, because of health issues, we had our child at 23. We had to have children young. We both had not finished school. So if we did not have our parents' support in those early years, we would never have been able to make it, So we live in a culture where we get support from our parents, and then we also take care of our parents when they get older. And I think this is a pretty beautiful idea, and much healthier than what we see around us. So Punjabi culture is not totally horrible. This, especially family values, can be a really powerful thing, something that could be valued and cherished. Go on. But when I sat down to think about other aspects of Punjabi culture that were positive, I realized that more and more when we think of positive Punjabi values are actually Sikh values. So when we talk about working hard, That's not something that all Punjabis have or all people in India have. That's a real Sikh value. When we talk about being honest and being fair in the work that you do, that's a Sikh value. When you talk about taking care of people so that whenever there's a natural disaster, whenever there's a problem, Sikhs will just open up their wallets. And we see that. I remember when the Haiti earthquake happened, the Surrey Gurdwara raised $1 million in like a week. And they're not super rich Sikhs in Canada. You know, most of these people are from middle class families. But when it comes down to it, how long did they take to raise it, Japnam? Do you remember? It was a few days, right? So Japnam Singh actually volunteered and went to Haiti from Vancouver with a group of other Sikhs. So we have that tradition that when things like that happen, we open up our wallets, our hearts to help people. That's not a Punjabi trait. That's a Sikh trait, actually. That's not something you see in the rest of South Asia, unfortunately. Let's go on. So even the fact that we talk about gender equality, that's definitely not a Punjabi trait. That's a Sikh trait. So here we can see Morche, which were peaceful protests, and these are women. The one on the left is from Punjabi Suba in the 1960s. The one on the right is from the independence movement in the 1930s. These are women who are with their children going out to give arrest and be arrested by British and Indian governments, you know, depending on the time period, for the rights of everyone in India. So this is our tradition, where women play a not only complementary but a exemplary role, where they were the ones who were on the forefront encouraging Sikh men and raising Sikh children to have those values. SGPC, when it was created in 1920, which is considered like the parliament of the Sikhs, now it's a horrible corrupt system. But in 1920, it gave women the right to vote. And you know what? It wasn't even a question. They didn't even debate it. It was obvious. Regardless of how much women might have been discriminated against in Punjab in the 1920s, the fact is, when it came to making up the rules, they were like, of course, women should have the exact same rules and opportunities as men. In many Western countries in the 1920s, women did not have the right to vote. And Switzerland didn't give women the right to vote until 1971. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So, even values of democracy. So Sikhs love taking part in elections. In Canada especially, we are overrepresented. What's our population in Canada, Thompson? Do you know? What? 1% of the population, but we have MPs, which are like congressmen, and we have MLAs, which are like state senators in several different provinces, which are like states. You guys know what it is anyways. So we love getting involved in elections and politics and democracy, and that's actually part of the Sikh tradition. So before the American Revolution, before the French Revolution, Sikhs were practicing democracy in the early 1700s. So when we talk about the birthplace of democracy, it was the jungles of Punjab. Let's go on to the next slide. So what we want to do is we want to try to create our own unique culture. And we have roots of that. We have glimpses of it. And I think all of us, you know, nowadays sort of Nahang traditions or Shastra Vidya or Gurmat Sangeet, they're becoming more and more popular. A lot of us are wearing the malle now, whereas before we never used to wear them. Sort of older traditions of the Panth are starting to become more prevalent because I think all of us are feeling like we want to meet up or tie back to something that's authentic, right? There's that thirst, that feeling that neither of these cultures are speaking to us and we need to create our own space. So I know you guys are getting tired. Could everyone stand up for a second? It's always the guys who fall asleep. Okay, that's good. Sit down. I went to Floors United Camp this past summer, and I was amazed. I came in to give a lecture, and every girl was totally sitting quietly and had like a notebook out and was taking notes. I was like, I've never seen this at a camp where there's boys involved. So I don't know why. You guys are a disaster. Okay? I was just as bad when I was younger though, so I can't speak. Can we go to the next slide? So what is an ideal Sikh life? How long did Guru Nanak Sahib Ji travel for? How long were his udasis? Anyone know?
30 years.
30 years. How old was he when he came back to Punjab after his udasis? Well, basic Sikh history, we have to learn this, guys. He was 50 years old, okay? What was the average life expectancy in the 1400s, do you guys think? In your 40s. So besides Guru Nanak Sahib and Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, every Guru passed away in their 40s or 30s. Not including Guru Har Krishna Sahib Ji. That was an average age to die. It was normal. Sorry, Guru Amar Das as well. I apologize. You win. It was so obvious, that's why I didn't say it. You know? So Guru Nanak Sahib Ji at age 50 would be the equivalent for us of like an 80-year-old. I want us to think about that. He came back to Punjab and he created a town. What was the name of the town? Kartarpur. Town of the Creator, right? If he wanted, he could have sat there and Sikhs would have done everything for him, right? They would have done his seva, they would have brought him food, they would have given him clothes. He didn't have to lift another finger for the rest of his life. Traveling 30 years around the world, you can imagine how difficult that was. How tough he was, how broken his body was after all those years of travel. What did Guru Nanak Sahib Ji do every day of his life until the day he died? He worked. He went out into the fields and worked. He didn't have to work. He didn't need to. But if he was going to tell Sikhs that you have to do care, if he's going to tell Sikhs that you have to work hard and honestly, he wasn't just going to tell them, he was going to show them. That's what the Gurus do. Guru Nanak Sahib Ji, Guru Angad Sahib Ji both were farmers. Guru Arjan Sahib Ji, who built Darbar Sahib, Harmandir Sahib, who developed Amritsar, who built two other towns, another Kartarpur and Tarn. Does anyone know what Guru Arjan Sahib Ji and Mata Ganga Ji would do for money? They never ate langar at Harmandir Sahib. They served langar, they did seva there, but they never ate langar there themselves. They weaved baskets, which is considered a very low job. Guru Arjan and Mata Ganga Ji would weave baskets and sell it in the markets anonymously. So that is how they made money, and then they would buy their own food and make it themselves at home. So that is the values that your Guru wanted you to have. That it is important to work for your living. The Shabad, you guys can read it there. Like, when we talk about consumerism, worldly possessions, that need, that hunger can never be satisfied. That book can never be gotten rid of. Right? The only way that we can get rid of that, that's why everyone's running around, especially Western culture in Punjab as well, trying to fill it with material possessions, trying to fill it with food, trying to fill it with iPhones, is because internally they are missing something so integral to their life, which is Naam. Sache Naam bin kisse na lati book. Let's go on to the next slide. So we have Baba Farid saying, Rukhi sukhi khai ke thanda pani piyo, Farida dekh parai chopri, na tarasai jiyo. So we need to be careful with Bani. We don't need to now enforce that everyone doesn't eat rotis with butter on them, right? Or gyo, and that people come and drink cold water. There's a metaphor here. That Baba Farid is saying, be simple. And when you see someone that has more than you, don't be jealous. Which is the biggest thing. It's really hard not to be jealous. One of the most difficult things when you grow up, when you reach my age, is when you meet people from high school who have done better than you. And it is so heartbreaking that the first reaction of almost everyone is to be jealous of a person who's done better than you. And it speaks to our inner core selves that instead of being happy for people, our first instinct is like, oh, they don't deserve it. That guy was useless in school. Why did they, That's our first instinct, as most humans. And that's why when you see celebrities, when they fail, people get such pleasure out of it, right? They like newspapers, magazines, websites, they like just revel in it to see people fail. It's like, oh my God, yes, that person was taken down. Because we have this inherent jealousy of people that succeed instead of being happy for them, right? Let's go on to the, oh, actually, no, don't go on. Good call. I want you to imagine in your minds someone wearing makeup with long curly hair, high heels, and tights. Okay? Everyone got that image in their mind? Okay, go to the next slide, Baju. So who imagined a woman? This is King. This is King Louis XVI of France. He was the first person in European history to wear high heels. This is where the tradition of high heels was started, and they wore tights to show off their calf muscles, which is why they wore high heels. Women didn't wear high heels because women had to be covered up and wear dresses all the way down. They wore long hair to show off that they could spend money on having their hair be all fancy, which is where the tradition of wigs came, which is why all your guys' founding fathers had wigs. Is to copy these guys. Because that was the fashion at the time. And he wore makeup. Pretty fancy dude. So, 400 years ago, this is what an ideal man looked like in Europe. My point being that fashion changes remarkably quickly. So in the 1970s, men with chest hair are considered to be like really attractive and manly, and facial hair is considered really big, like mustaches were very popular. Whereas today, if you see any body hair on a guy, it's like, from popular culture, it's like, oh gross, that person's just disgusting, right? So what culture considers to be attractive or fashionable changes remarkably quickly. Could you go to the next slide? Whereas what the Guru has given us is timeless. So that if I went back 400 years ago and saw Sikh, I would immediately recognize who the Sikh was. And if I go 1,000 years into the future, I could immediately recognize who the Sikh is. So we don't think about it, but when we are obsessed with fashion, we are a slave to fashion. We are willing to mutilate ourselves, literally, right? Either through starvation, or removing body hair in painful ways, or wasting tons of money on styling our hair, or changing how we dress and wasting money year after year on buying clothes that are in fashion. Whatever it is, we are slaves to what society is telling us is attractive, instead of being true to ourselves. I'm not saying we have to live in Bana all the time. I don't wear Bana all the time. I don't want to have front here either. It's a lot more comfortable at camps, and I enjoy wearing it when I'm in a Sikh atmosphere. But the point is that Sikhs should be dressing simply and modestly, without excess, like we should be doing everything. And if you could go to the next slide. Guruji doesn't want us to have a boring life. The point of a Sikh life is not to sit there in an empty room and not have fun, not make jokes, never read a book or watch a movie, and just like never smile. The point is to take part in life, to make friends, to have relationships, to interact with people, to be creative. But to do that within limits, without indulging, without going crazy, without losing yourself. That's the key. That's what Guruji is talking about. That's what Guru Arjan Sahib is talking about. Is that once you meet the true Guru, you are able to connect and be Jivan Mukh when you are laughing, playing, eating. Everything is positive then. So I get this comment from non-Amritadis all the time, which is, Bhai, you're so funny for an Amritadi. And I don't know why that's considered that Amritadis are people who claim to be religious Sikhs, why we have a reputation for being non-funny. And maybe that speaks to how seriously we may take ourselves, or a sign of commitment that we don't want to, because I talk to so many Sikhs where it's like, yeah, we don't watch movies, and I know they're all watching movies at home. You know? They all are. Let's not pretend. They're all watching TV. So instead of putting on a show of what we think an ideal Sikh should be, we should be comfortable in who we are and be comfortable with the choices we're making as long as we're not ashamed of them, right? Let's move on to the next slide. So I thought these two pictures were really sweet. Like that old Nahang's pulling his wife on the bike, and this old baby is helping her husband wash his gas at the bar side, right? So a relationship that is solid and committed is possible. And it can be a loving and tender relationship. But it needs to be built on values that are deep and meaningful. Bhai Singh, when he was in jail, used to write letters, poetry to his wife. And you can find them in the book. They're literally love poems that he would write to his wife. He had a loving relationship with her. When we think of a Gursikh, we think of that type of behavior as being like, no, not acceptable. So we kind of created a weird image of what Sikhi relations are, right? When Guru Nanak said he went back to meet his mother for the first time after his first Udasi, according to the Jamsak, both him and his mother cried and hugged each other because they missed each other so much. Now, I don't know if Guruji really cried, and I'm a little bit hesitant, you know, but still, the point is that there is loving relationships there between individuals. So when we talk about being udas in this world, when we say we are live from the world, we need to think of it in a positive sense, not in a negative sense. So that Guru Gobind Singh Ji challenges us not to not be in love with people, but to be in love with everyone at the equal level. That's a real challenge. Is to recognize Vaiguru in everyone. Not to shut yourself off from everyone, right? So that relationship, a marriage relationship, is the best place to develop that. According to Bhai Gurdas Ji, what is the minimum amount you need for a Sangha? 2 people. So this is an amazing idea that if you can form a healthy, Sikhi-based relationship with a person that you love and you can raise a family, you can have a Sangat in your house, you can have a Gurdwara in your house every day. You can have Sad Sangat all the time. That's an amazing idea. The idea is that you are helping each other grow, that you're supporting each other to do Bhaj, Simran, Seva, Amritullah, that you are growing with each other closer to the Guru. So you guys are at an age where some of you are close to thinking about marriage and thinking about the choices that you're going to make. And you need to think about what are the qualities that I'm going to look for in a partner. What are the things that I value in another person? Because I can tell you that if you disagree on basic things like core values, how to raise children, small issues that people think aren't a big deal, they become huge deals after you get married. So when people are like, well, it's fine, it'll work out after marriage, it doesn't work out after marriage, it gets worse. Because you start getting annoyed by every little thing the other person does, trust me. And when you got bigger issues, those become huge. Taran was asking me last night, what are most of my fights with my wife about? Most of my fights with my wife are about the fact that I chew too loudly when I eat, and she doesn't pick up her clothes when she takes them off in the bedroom, and there's clothes all over the bedroom. And I'm kind of a neat freak. So those type of things become fights in a relationship, right? That she makes me sit on the other side of the room when I eat, because I chew really disgustingly according to her. And I'm disgusted by how she doesn't clean up after herself, okay? So those are the types of things that become problems in a marriage. If you got bigger issues like, are we going to raise our 6 kids with the stars? Are we going to tie the stars on our daughters, for example? Are we going to try to ensure that we always take out this fun and we are willing to compromise on going on vacation or buying gifts for ourselves or buying a nice new car if it is going to cut into the fun that we're going to take out? Those types of values are important. That's what matters. What doesn't matter is how long your deras is, okay? And what doesn't matter is what your nithin is. Those basic things you need to work past, because if we're going to divide up who we're going to marry based on those criteria, there's going to be no one left to marry, right? There's not that many Sikhs out there, right? There's a lot of Punjabis, but there are not that many people with Sikh values. So look at the real core values, the things that really matter. Let's go on to the next slide. So in both these cultures, you can see Punjabi culture over time has gotten more and more discussed in a lot of ways. Western culture has gotten more and more corrupt in a lot of ways too. But to be honest, everyone always thinks that their society is the worst. You can go back 100 years and people are like, oh my God, it's horrible. We've never seen it, the world's falling apart. So that's always, things always look really bad. In a lot of ways, our world is not that bad. Income inequality is one of the lowest levels in human history. Life expectancy is the highest level in human history. We've eradicated major diseases. The world's looking really good in a lot of ways, but in sort of core values, people are totally empty and left without any meaning in their lives. And we are given something that is so perfect and eternal that will never lose relevancy. You need to grasp onto it. Next slide. I think we're on the last slide. And the fact of the matter is that Khalsa values, Khalsa culture, can never be outdated because it is just so revolutionary. Maharaja Ranjit Singh was a horrible guy in a lot of ways, he was. But in the 1800s, he outlawed capital punishment. Nobody was executed in the Punjab state for crimes. America still kills people, right, for capital punishment. Sikhs controlled Punjab, and not one person was forcibly converted to Sikhi. So we were 12% of the population, and we ruled the state. And the Prime Minister of Punjab, under Maharaja Ranjit Singh, was a Muslim. Muslims who had been the main enemy of Sikhs for the previous 100 years. So those are Sikh values. Those are revolutionary values. That 150, 200 years ago, that was amazing. That's still amazing today. You don't see that type of thing in societies, right? That Guru Gobind Singh Sahib Ji in Akalas says that black people and white people are the same. At a time period when no one in human history even considered black people to be animals. When Portuguese missionaries, so priests, went to Africa, and they were one of the first missionaries to go to Africa, they wrote an official Christian document saying that it was okay to rape black women because they were animals and they didn't have souls. And so you're allowed to have sex with them, even though you're supposed to be celibate. That's the same time period that Guru Gobind Singh Ji is saying that everyone in the world has a Jyot light inside of them. So these are revolutionary core values that can never be made outdated. So we haven't come close to living up to what Khalsa values are. Things that people like Baba Janel Singh fought for 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Where we would be fighting for the rights of people in all of India, for example, to have basic human rights. So Sikhi culture, people may look at us and say, you guys are backwards with your turbans and your beards and all that kind of stuff. When it comes to core values, we are the most progressive people on the planet. We are on the forefront of every movement. We should be. And the gurus were speaking about things that nobody else was talking about, that people still are hesitant to talk about today. So I want us to end off on that note, that we need to think about what is Sikh culture? How can you make Sikh culture? What are the values of Sikh culture? And what are the values of Punjabi and Western culture that you want to reject, that you don't want in your families? And what are the values that you want to keep? Because you guys are going to be getting married soon if you're not married yet. And the values that you give your children, the way you raise your daughters and sons, the way you treat your husbands and wives, that's how change happens in the planet. So when people say, how can we change the planet, how can we help it? It happens in families. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate you guys paying attention. It was wonderful. Besides you sleepy guys over here. I'll be happy. So Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa. Before we go, if there's a few questions on your painting.
Vaheguru.
Can you guys slide for the questions?
I was wondering why some castes that still in all parts of families, and just understanding Iman. What's your opinion on that, and how is it being followed?
So, when we look at Sikh history, the Gurus always brought about revolution in a gradual process. So the Gurus got rid of the idea that caste determined your spirituality, and they got rid of the idea that caste determined your profession. So you could do any job you wanted, essentially. But caste still had a social role to play in Punjab, in that people still generally married within their own caste. Okay? The problem with that is that over time, we have started to go back to being proud of our caste and looking down on other castes. So that is something that we really need to move out of and work against. And one of the really easy ways to do this, to go back to what Guru Gobind Singh Ji did, is to stop using our caste names, right? And stop in the choices you make when you get married, stop looking at that. Make that not even a criteria. So we can talk about how bad it is in Punjab, but really we have to be the change, right? That we want to see in the world. Is that the quote?
So like that is our Punjab.
And here.
We won't do it on
So there's Gurdwaras that do all sorts of horrible stuff. There's a Gurdwara in New York that wouldn't let you work for bonds last year, right? So in Rochester, I don't know if you guys know that. There's a Gurdwara in Rochester, New York that's banned for bonds. So we can talk about Gurdwaras doing ridiculous stuff all the time. We don't need to, let's move away from that. Let's talk about the changes we can make. Any other questions? Comments? Okay, Padre, what do we want to do now? Wrap up?